So if you call them out on their emotionally immature behavior and ask them, don't you see it? Are you not listening to yourself? Then I'll tell you what you're going to experience, not their insight, but their rage. It's like thunder and lightning. First you see the crack of lightning, then you hear the clap of thunder. Narcissistic apologies, right? So much fun. Well, let's think about it. Let's break it down. When you get an apology from a narcissistic person, is it an apology or is it actually a defense? So you can drop this in the comments, your feelings about the narcissistic apologies you've received or even what they look like. There are few things more painful and invalidating to experience than an apology from a narcissistic person, right? Narcissistic people don't really apologize. They deflect, they rationalize, they blame shift. I am sorry you feel that way. An apology, true apology, contains contrition, accountability, and awareness of the harm to another person. I'm sorry for what I did, it hurt you, and I take responsibility for my action. Apologies are really about making amends in an honest way. It all seems so simple, right? That true apology is all but impossible for a narcissistic person. The thing that they often do, though, is they turn the apology into a bit of a defense. So let's take a look at some examples. It might be things like, okay, I'm sorry I yelled at you. Are you happy now? Because I yell because I'm never heard or appreciated. If you could just show me that you care, then I wouldn't be so on edge. So weigh in. Is that an apology? Or is that merely them defending themselves? Personally, I think it's a defense wrapped up in a gaslighted bow. That's the struggle, right? More often than not, narcissistic apologies basically feel like they're defending themselves. It's like they're providing an evidence base for the thing that they're actually supposed to apologize for. Their mouths form the words, I'm sorry, but it ends up being an entry into a big defensive mess. This comes up a lot in situations involving narcissistic infidelity. They'll say something like, okay, I get it. You're mad at me. I'm sorry. Ugh, I've been feeling ignored for a while since the kids were born, or since you got your new job, or since your parents moved into town. Fill in the blank on whatever the reason they gave you for cheating on you. And we weren't spending that much time together anymore. And then you decided to take that vacation with your sister. And all that time I had to spend alone, what did you expect? Does that feel like an apology to you? I didn't think so. Now, for a narcissistic person to genuinely apologize can feel almost impossible. To do so, to apologize, is a sort of psychological recognition that they are human and flawed and not perfect. And that cracks through their grandiosity and evokes all kinds of shame. So they may do the sort of pseudo-apology to get out of trouble, or to look good, or just to be able to say that they apologized. But in fact, the I am sorry is a setup for the defense that's about to come. You can call it a defense or a rationalization, whatever, but ultimately it is meant to say, okay, I did a thing that you didn't like, but you got to see it was understandable. For a narcissistic person, they invoke that self-defense argument all the time. The word sorry tricks us into thinking we just heard an apology, but you didn't really. Dig deeper, write out what they said if you need, and if you will see that nearly every narcissistic apology you have ever received was really them defending themselves and never an accountability. Now this doesn't feel good. Listen, we are human beings. We make mistakes in relationships all the time. That's normal. And relationships can and often do absolutely move forward from these mistakes. That happens, though, when the other person, or whoever the person is, even you, when you did something wrong, you take genuine accountability, you acknowledge the other person's pain, you make amends, and you don't keep doing the thing that required the apology. Relationships not only move forward from that, they can actually grow. The entire enterprise of narcissistic apologies is really all about gaslighting, deflection, and their maintenance of their grandiose and perfect vision of themselves, while continuing to paint you out as the problem who's too sensitive, and then their behavior as being understandable. So when you do finally get that apology, that so-called apology, you often don't feel whole, because ultimately it wasn't an apology. And you'd be surprised, even therapists can get tricked by that. Couples therapists will say, well, look, he just said sorry. But if it had all that gaslighty schmutz underneath it, not so sure it was an apology. Don't let the word trick you. Pay attention to all the other festoonery around that I'm sorry, and make sure it's not just them defending their bad behavior. Think to yourself, what are some things you should never say to a narcissist? That's what this little series is going to take on. Every so often I'm going to be putting out these videos that really answers this question. What should you not say to a narcissist? So here's one for you. Have you ever asked a narcissist this question? Do you listen to yourself? Have you ever asked a narcissist that question? Sometimes by learning the things to not say, you can actually make the rather bumpy road of a relationship with a narcissist a little bit of a more survivable space. But let's go to this idea. Asking or saying to the narcissist, do you ever listen to yourself? Now, this is definitely not a good thing to say to a narcissist, but it's so tempting to say it, right? Nonetheless, do you ever listen to yourself? When you have to listen to the gaslighted, delusional, manipulative, victimized rants that come out of them, you just want to ask them, are you listening to yourself? As always, I am telling you to avoid saying all the various things I'm going to tell you in this series as they unfold, because if you cave into that, you're going to be left facing their dysregulated rage. And let me tell you, even if you feel a momentary satisfaction by saying these things to them or asking them these questions, their rage is actually really, really uncomfortable, miserable experience to have to be in the face of. So why would you want to ask them this question? Mostly because what they're saying doesn't make sense. Are you listening to yourself? Many people who are experiencing narcissistic relationships will be so confused by what they are hearing that they will first doubt themselves and think, maybe I'm hearing this wrong, or maybe I'm seeing this as worse than it is, or I'm so confused, or maybe they're right. All of that, that's what the gaslighting does to us. It leaves us questioning our entire reality and ourselves. But the reason this is a bad question is because it misses the damaging alchemy of two key patterns in narcissistic people. Their lack of ability to be self-reflective, to really think about themselves, and their lack of insight, and their emotional dysregulation and their impulsivity. People with narcissistic personality styles lack insight. It's central to this personality style. They are unable to think about how their behavior affects other people. And that is also in large part due to their lack of empathy. Because even if they did know, they don't care. And there's also a lack of capacity to think deeply about feelings, motivations, or behavior in people who are narcissistic. There's a very infantile organization to the narcissistic personality. And so sort of higher order levels of thought, like we should see in adult, such as the implications of what they are saying or how the message could be received, it doesn't even enter their minds. But for a minute, let's give folks who have narcissistic personalities a little bit of credit. Because let's face it, they are not psychotic. They are not completely devoid of insight. They're not completely absent of the capacity for rational thought. After all, narcissistic people are highly successful in society. So even if they do have a little self-reflective capacity, for example, narcissistic people know how to schmooze a new client to get them to buy something. They know how to be nice to the boss. They're skillful at taking their rage out on people who don't have much power. So ultimately, what really does the narcissist in, it's not just that lack of empathy and that lack of self-reflection, it's the impulsivity. When a narcissistic person is having a strong feeling or belief, they just have to say it. Inhibition is not in their vocabulary. This impulsivity is why we see their high levels of reactivity, their disinhibited rage, even the dangerous driving. Narcissistic people just say it first and maybe, just maybe, might apologize later, and they'll come up with some kind of sad justification after the fact. And then, since they are dysregulated, they turn around and they do it again. Narcissism is all about tension reduction. They do not like it when strong feelings come up in them, or when they feel inadequate, or when they feel abandoned. So they just have to let those uncomfortable feelings out. And then they often will say bizarre, menacing, terrifying, confusing, threatening, angering, and or hurtful things. So if you were to say to them, "Are you listening to yourself?" When they hear that from you, it activates their shame. In fact, I can all but guarantee it will. After one of their infantile breakdowns, they don't like it being shown to them, or it being pointed out to them, or being reminded of it. So if you call them out on their emotionally immature behavior and ask them, "Don't you see it? Are you not listening to yourself?" Then I'll tell you what you're going to experience, not their insight, but their rage. It's like thunder and lightning. First you see the crack of lightning, then you hear the clap of thunder. With narcissistic people, first they experience their shame, and then, just like the thunder, comes the rage. If you ask them are you listening to yourself? They will actually blame you for their meltdown and take no responsibility for their conduct. And it can be extremely frustrating and confusing to listen to that. So the best play? Don't ask the question in the first place. The short answer of, should I ask this question? No. Even if they are listening to themselves, even if they were, they don't want to be held accountable. Remember, taking responsibility is not something we ever observe in the narcissistic personality style. And the fact is, they don't care enough about you or your feelings or anyone else to stop themselves. That impulsivity is more important than anything else. This question to a narcissist, "Are you listening to yourself?" is never going to get an honest or clear answer from somebody with a high conflict personality style. So ideally, don't ask it. Because here's the thought. Maybe the narcissistic folks are smarter than the rest of us. You know why? They know better, and they often don't listen to themselves. Maybe we should take a page out of that playbook and not listen to them either. But this is a key thing, to not ask people who are narcissistic this question. What's going to come back at you is not good for you. It's not going to move the needle. It's probably going to make things worse, and you're just going to have to accept they can't self-reflect. They're very impulsive, and the combination of all that means, no, they're not listening to themselves. And if they were, they're going to blame you for it. In many ways, a narcissist is made of Teflon. Like, they are able to deflect blame and responsibility for so many things. We sometimes see this in very public cases. A big corporate wonk or celebrity who's quite narcissistic does something bad, and until the 11th hour, they dodge, they duck, they deflect, and they definitely don't take responsibility until they're really cornered with a smoking gun. And then they'll make some sorts of half-hearted efforts to take some responsibility, but then they'll often say that classical narcissistic defense. Instead of saying, "I'm so sorry for what I've done and for the people I've hurt," they'll say, "I'm sorry that they feel that way." That's not taking responsibility, is it? So that experience, whether it happens on an international level because of a scandal, or it's happening in your own life, is incredibly invalidating. And in fact, it can be quite dehumanizing that a person is simply not doing the adult thing and taking responsibility for something that's happening in their lives. We all screw up. We all screw up. And the most noble thing we can do is step up and say, "I did this, and I'm responsible for this," and take the hits on that and move forward. At a minimum, it's good karma. But we live in a very litigious society where attorneys on a regular basis are instructing their clients, "Don't cop to this yet. Let me see what I can do. So when the system is set up, we're taking responsibility for something that in fact you did do wrong or did do. To not take responsibility is incentivized. You can see how a narcissist will run with that. In fact, a lot of people will think that a person who does take responsibility is a bit of a sucker for doing that and taking a harder hit than they need to. When we don't take responsibility in a close relationship for something we did or said or didn't do or didn't say, it is very hurtful to the other person or people in those relationships. Sometimes simply taking responsibility is all that another person needs. It goes farther than an apology. For a person to say, I did do that. I don't even have a good explanation for why I did, but I did. And if they throw in and I'm sorry and mean it, well then you're getting more than what most people would ever get with a narcissist. But that ability to take responsibility is very difficult because shame is such a key dynamic in narcissism. Shame is sort of a public emotion where the public disapproves, and what that means is if there's shame in the house, the narcissist is afraid that they may not get their validation and admiration that they typically need. So when they don't take responsibility, they're able to dodge that shame bullet for at least for as long as they can. And some people never take responsibility for a lifetime. It ends up becoming at best a deathbed confession, which is very dissatisfying and in fact quite meaningless for the person who receives it. If you're in a relationship with somebody who chronically doesn't take responsibility for the things they do or don't do, pay attention to that, because over a lifetime, that ends up taking a toll on your soul. In a family system, when people don't take responsibility, it can be really destabilizing. It erodes a sense of trust within that family, and people start becoming very defensive or just simply pulling away from the system because nobody is taking responsibility for what's happening. It's a terrible lesson for children to see, because probably one of the most noble things we can show a child is even if you do something wrong, step up, do the right thing, and take responsibility for it. In many situations, children often are taught like that's really all we want from them as adults is to take ownership. That it's a terrifying thing to do, but once they do it, not only can it help them prevent them from engaging these behaviors in the future, but it also teaches them to be a grown-up when the time comes and actually take responsibility for their actions. We're living in a world where more and more people are doing bad things and hoping they can deny them after the fact and get away with it, rather than really doing the humane thing and taking ownership for them. That kind of culture not only plays out on global, national kinds of stages, or even within a company or a school or a family, but where it really breaks our heart is when it happens one-on-one with the people we allegedly love and who are supposed to love us, who just simply cannot take responsibility for what they've done or said. Again, pay attention to the pattern. When it happens, your best recourse is to reflect on what this means and what this person is about. That pattern of deflecting and not taking responsibility tends to be pretty chronic, and it's not particularly amenable to change. You can certainly try, and sometimes people can find through therapy, they can encourage a partner to be able to say, yeah, I did do that. But sometimes after a lifetime or years of hearing that, they finally do start taking responsibility. It may be too little, too late. At the end of the day, if you spend enough time with any given narcissistic person, they will seem emotionally cold. One thing that happens to them is they get emotionally depleted really, really quickly. And so what might happen is, especially if you go through a period of love bombing with a narcissist, when they're really trying to win you over and showing you the best time of your life and you're falling in love, the last thing in the world you would think is this person is emotionally cold, because they're often very sexy and they're really on and they just really seem well put together and charming and charismatic. They don't always seem cold. We view someone who's emotionally cold as being really remote, really distant, sometimes even really disparaging or dismissing. For a narcissistic person, once they start getting emotionally exhausted, which happens a couple of months into the relationship, there are times they seem so depleted that they really just don't care. They almost look right through you. And many times for people who spend time with narcissists, they'll say, it's as though they just don't care, to which I've often have to tell people I work with clinically, yeah, they kind of don't. So that emotional coldness can almost feel like the sun
permanently going back behind a bunch of clouds after the sunniest day you've ever been through. The warmest day in the world turns cold very quickly. When that happens, a lot of people in a relationship with a narcissist feel really panicky. They try to take life back. I want to go back to the way it was. I want to go back to the way it was. But what's hard to understand is that the way it was actually just a short-term thing. And the way it is, the more remote, cold, unempathic, and distant place you're in right now is how it's going to be. And that's a hard adjustment because we tend to sort of fixate on the way something started, especially if it was good. The emotional coldness we see in many people who are narcissistic is often a byproduct of the lack of empathy, as well as the sense of deep insecurity they hold, and they're not being in contact with their emotional worlds. By staying very superficial and staying on the grandiose, sort of the top level, they don't do the big emotional deep dives that often results in the emotional richness and connection that makes a relationship emotionally warm. That emotional coldness can, again, be, like I said, very confusing, especially if you experience something very different in the beginning. If you have a narcissistic parent, that emotional coldness likely took a tremendous toll on you as a child, because the last thing a child wants to see a parent be is cold and distant. It can be really, really disorienting and disarming for a child who looks to their parent for nurturance, consistency, safety, and warmth. An emotionally cold parent can be a real factor in a more anxious or avoidant attachment style that a child takes into adulthood that can then evince and then manifest in having far less satisfying and healthy adult relationships. In fact, many narcissistic people likely came from families where one or both parents were emotionally cold and distant. The emotional coldness of narcissism is something that can sometimes run hot and cold. Because a narcissist is really good at playing to an audience, they can really turn on the seeming warmth, even if it's faking it, in front of a group of people. And then when you get home with them alone, they go back to their cold state. It's as though they exhausted or burned themselves out, putting on that big emotional show for other people. But once they're back to being remote. You might think like, here they are, they're on, they're warm, they're with a group. When we go home, everything's going to be okay. And then it doesn't turn out to be that way. The emotional coldness of narcissism can really, really take a toll on the mental health of somebody who's in any kind of relationship with a narcissist, whether as their child, as their parent, as their partner, as their friend, even as their colleague, collaborator, or coworker. It can leave any of us feeling a sense of self-doubt, maybe even feeling depressed and anxious, and maybe even like we ourselves are not enough. If we were better, then they would be warmer. And it can lead to a lot of self-blame for anyone who's in any kind of a relationship with a narcissist. The emotional coldness in narcissism does tend to persist over time, and if anything, it may even get worse with age. For people in a relationship with a narcissist, the emotional coldness can be a really rough space. It may require therapy as a place to work it through, and certainly the cultivation of other close, connected friendships and relationships so you can have that experience of human warmth and human connectedness.
So let's face it, everyone in toxic relationships is told one thing: set boundaries, right? In fact, everyone in every relationship is told to set boundaries in all of their relationships, family relationships, intimate relationships, workplaces, relationships, friendships, right? Boundaries is a big issue, right? Boundaries means being clear on issues ranging from time to communication to sex, anything, to give ourselves permission to set a line, to feel safe, and to communicate that line, right? I'm guilty of this, right? It's one of even the elements of healing I put out there is giving the guidance that you should attempt to set boundaries in a narcissistic relationship. In some ways, it's a test. And once you see the narcissistic person will ignore or continue to violate the boundaries, please view that as a bit of a wake-up call. I know that the boundaries won't work, but many people want to rule everything out before they think a toxic relationship is absolutely done. So you set the boundaries. You actually may get stronger. You might get stronger through therapy, maybe because you've been educating yourself about narcissism. Maybe you just get stronger from sheer exasperation, but you get stronger, you follow the guidance, and you really finally do it. You set the boundaries. And then, you know what the narcissist does? They call you controlling. I hear this over and over again from people who attempt to set boundaries in their narcissistic relationships. For years, they didn't set boundaries in these relationships because they were confused, or they blamed themselves, or they did not understand what they were dealing with. Some folks did not set them because they just didn't know how to set them. I mean, let's face it, the vast majority of people are not taught how to set boundaries in childhood. And if you had a narcissistic parent, then forget about it. You were never given permission to set boundaries. And if you did, you would have faced rage and punishment. And if you didn't even get to see boundaries being set, maybe even by your other parent or within the family system, when you didn't see them being enacted, it's hard to do something that you were never taught or that you were never given permission to do. But once you set the boundaries anywhere, it may be directly with the narcissistic person, it may be with someone or something else, and your boundary setting is observed by the narcissistic and by a narcissistic person in your life. But when your boundaries are observed, you setting boundaries is observed by a narcissistic person, they will likely tell you that you're being controlling. And obviously that's a bit of a projection. So let's lay this out as a bit of a scenario, right? You are in a narcissistic relationship. Let's say it's with a parent, right? But you can substitute anyone in there. The parent expects you in a very entitled manner to keep doing things for them as soon as they ask you to do them. It is eating into your time and making your life difficult, and you're very busy. You have tried in gentle and appropriate ways to push them off, tried to get siblings to help, or done what they needed in a rush. But more often than not, you do what they need to get done, but you're getting more resentful. Finally, one day, after taking so much time to do the many frivolous things that the narcissistic parent expects you to do, when they expect you to do them, with little awareness of how this is affecting you, you tell the parent, hey, I can't do this every day. I can do these things like once a week, and that's it. Anything else is going to just have to wait till the next week. And please also don't call me during work hours because it's quite disruptive. And then you do that, good boundaries, and the parent accuses you of being controlling, cold, and maybe even manipulative. It can be quite startling to have someone tell you that you are controlling after years of walking on eggshells and then finally making clear what you would think would be clear to any self-aware person. But there's the rub. They aren't self-aware. That's the issue. You, me, all of us, we all exist at their need and at their whim. They are delusional enough to think that we are the problem, that they are always right, and that we have no right to set a boundary. And if we are, then we're being controlling. Narcissistic people pathologize and shame qualities in others, which make their lives more difficult or pick away at their sense of grandiosity and entitlement. If they are the greatest and all-powerful, well, then how could somebody actually set boundaries on them? I mean, nobody sets boundaries with the king, right? If you, from an early age, saw the message that setting boundaries was a bad thing, and then attempted to set boundaries, and are then told that you are being controlling, it can discourage you from wanting to set them or from setting them at all. Narcissistic people find that shaming and calling you crazy works. And these comments often will stop you from engaging in the behavior that's inconveniencing them. So it's a really, really clever manipulation, isn't it? Setting boundaries with narcissistic folks will not result in them changing their behavior or honoring the boundaries, but it will perhaps result in you opening your eyes wider to what you're seeing. I know that some people don't set them because they are afraid of the narcissistic person's rage, or they are afraid of losing the narcissistic person from their life. The narcissistic relationship is often about all of us holding back because we are afraid they will disappear if we ask too much or set a boundary. That is your work because this is an unhealthy space. And for all of us to work on unpacking our trauma bonds to help diminish the power of the narcissistic folks in our lives. As a result, many people in narcissistic relationships, often in order to survive, will find themselves immersed in denial. By not setting boundaries, you don't then have to see how bad the narcissistic relationship is. But once you do set the boundary and witness their reaction, it's a painful and stark reminder of how dysfunctional the relationship is. It can be easier to not set the boundaries at all and remain in denial. Because once you set the boundaries and see what it really is about, the grief can be overwhelming. But that, in the long run, is not good for you. So with boundary setting, start small. Start practicing boundary setting with the healthier people in your life who will be willing to respect the boundaries, and then start building up those boundaries in other areas. It can be painful to witness what happens in the relationships when you do set boundaries. But even if you stay, at least you will do so with your eyes wide open and not believing that this is going to change. And no, setting an appropriate boundary is not controlling, no matter what they say to you. Listen, after you have been through narcissistic abuse, you no longer feel safe. It's a very classical part of the profile of narcissistic abuse. Now, by lack of safety, I don't mean that you think that someone is standing behind you with a weapon, though you may feel that metaphorically, but just a general lack of a sense of psychological safety with other people. Some of this relates to the difficulties with trust, which is also a part of narcissistic abuse, which is another video in this series, but it goes beyond that. Lack of safety is a discomfort. Like I said, it extends beyond, it goes beyond just not being able to trust people. It's a mishmash of stuff, a cynicism, a fear of speaking your mind, a reticence, or a sort of holding back. Yeah, a lack of trust, a feeling like you can't completely exhale, a fear of being gaslighted again. You simply feel as though you can't let your guard down. Remember, when you entered any narcissistic relationships voluntarily, typically you entered these as an adult. And as a result, it's easy to feel like you were played, that you were tricked, or that you're even foolish, which you're not. And that can leave you feeling unsafe, as though you can't trust your own instincts after making that big mistake. After being gaslighted, not just by your partner, but by other people around you. The narcissist enablers, people around you who just don't get it, the almighty gaslighting by tribe that I've talked about. You may just not know who to believe anymore. It messes with your head and makes it so that you're always looking with a bit of suspiciousness around you. It's like one of those crime movies where nobody quite trusts anybody and everyone's kind of on edge. It's a very exhausting way to live, especially since you're not trying to live like you're in a crime movie. If you grew up in a narcissistic family system, lack of safety is pretty much sort of baked into you. Because your development was characterized by confusion, conditional regard, invalidation, you didn't know. You never knew what was going to set off the rage in one or both of your parents. As a result, you never really felt safe. You may have been attempting to be a peacemaker so things wouldn't escalate when you were a kid, or you felt like you had to hide yourself because you were the scapegoat. Either way, nobody feels safe in these family systems. And when you grow up feeling unsafe, that trails you into adulthood in a million subtle ways. Safety is the second level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Remember, like food on the bottom and then on and on and on? In fact, the only fundamental level that's deeper than safety is food and water. To be safe is an essential human need, and we devote a lot of psychological resources to it if it isn't coming easily. So feeling unsafe is really awful for a human being, and that, sadly, is one of the long-term legacies of narcissistic abuse. Other videos in this series highlight symptoms and patterns such as hypervigilance, that kind of on-edgeness, which we do observe in people experiencing narcissistic abuse. And that pattern also gets at that on-edge sort of lack of safety feeling. The lack of safety means that people don't quite feel in their skin, and also means that it can be quite difficult to establish new relationships, especially after a narcissistically abusive one ends, or if you still have narcissistically abusive relationships in your lives. People who have experienced narcissistic abuse may initially only stick to the tried and true people in their life. They may regard new people with suspicion. In fact, many people who have been through narcissistic abuse will say that they fear that they will never fully feel at ease or fully feel safe with new people. It's not surprising. After being through narcissistic abuse, in some ways, sadly, you not only stop trusting yourself, you also stop trusting other people, and you never quite feel safe. The challenging part of narcissistic abuse is that although it happens to so many people, so many more people just don't get it. So you will often get pushback from people who say, ugh, narcissistic abuse, that's not even a thing, or get over it, you're out of the relationship now, what are you still talking about this for? Or, oh, really? Well, they never hit you, so what are you so anxious about? What are you talking about, this lack of safety? Sometimes things just don't work out. It's the daily gaslighting and confusion and invalidation and the narcissist's unwillingness to take responsibility or ownership for their behavior that turns the whole thing upside down and makes it unlike any other kind of psychological pain you could experience in a relationship. The lack of safety, the sense of a lack of safety, results in a sort of what we'd call a tentativeness. It's almost like a person who is very carefully putting their foot into a swimming pool or another body of water. Is it cold? Is it safe? It's a sort of a carefulness, a slowness. And that's okay. So what do you do if you are experiencing this sense of a lack of safety? First of all, please be patient with yourself. I must say, for many people who have been through narcissistic abuse, there is sadly often a bit of a lifelong legacy of never quite ever feeling completely safe. It'll maybe always take you just a little bit longer to warm up, to feel okay with other people, to trust them, to let your guard down. And that's okay. Don't put yourself on other people's schedule and other people's sort of agenda. Safety, that sense of safety may happen with time, but perhaps by being a little bit more on guard at the beginning, you may also protect yourself and keep the gates closed on another narcissist or toxic person getting too close to you. Secondly, start small. After a narcissistic relationship, or even while you are still in one and enduring narcissistic abuse, start making inroads again with your own friend group. It's easy to get isolated when you are in a narcissistic relationship. So at a minimum, at least reflect on how safe you feel with people you have known for a while. Third, I want you to consider practicing mindfulness and meditation. These are wonderful daily practices, and sometimes just staying in the present moment and just reacting to the things that are in front of you and working on your breathing in that moment can give you a sense of your own inner world and self-possession, and can build your sense of safety from the inside out. Fourth, consider exercise. Somehow getting stronger can build a sense of safety from the outside in. Lift, build muscle. Also consider things like walking, feel your heartbeat. If you can create strength from the outside in and from the inside out, you might start feeling in better ownership, and also better ownership of your safety. And even though you may still feel that sort of lingering sense of a lack of safety from narcissistic abuse, doing these kinds of things can help you create a little bit more of a defense against this, and maybe feel a little bit safer, at least with yourself, and then slowly, hopefully, with the world. I hope this helps and makes sense. As always, thank you for tuning in. Always subscribe, notifications to get those notifications. Give a like if you liked it, and thank you.